By sunrise, all 14 horses had come back. Every single one of them. Wet to the chest from swamp water, reins dragging, saddles empty. But the men who rode them into the swamp the night before never returned. Overseer Duval counted the horses 3 times because the number felt impossible. He had watched those men ride out himself. Wade Thibodeau at the front, 14 armed bounty hunters behind him, dogs pulling at their leads, torches burning orange in the Louisiana dark. They had gone west toward the swamp road, toward the old Belqua Asylum, toward 3 enslaved brothers who were supposed to be caught by dawn, chained by dawn, sold by dawn. Instead, the horses came back alone, and 2 days later, when the sheriff finally stood at the broken iron gate of Belqua and studied the mud, he found 14 sets of tracks going in and none coming out. No one in Terrebonne Parish believed the official report. Not really. The record called it a structural collapse, an accident during a lawful fugitive recovery. 14 accidental deaths. But men in that parish had spent their whole lives lying about simpler things than this. And everybody understood one truth without saying it aloud. Something had happened inside that asylum. Something organized, something final. And whatever took place in there had been planned. To understand what happened inside Belqua on the night of September 7th, 1857, you have to begin with the parish itself. Because places like Terrebonne did not merely contain slavery. They were built to depend on it. Southern Louisiana in September was heat and standing water and sugar cane. Low country where the land and swamp never fully agreed on where one ended and the other began. Fields stretched flat from the river to the tree line. The air smelled of wet soil, cut cane, and labor that never stopped. Aldrich Fontenot owned 2,200 acres of that country. He also owned the credit that kept local merchants alive, the silence of the courthouse, and the habit people had of lowering their voices when his name entered a conversation. He was the 4th man in his family to own that land, the 4th to believe that ownership was natural, permanent, inherited like weather. He had never truly been told no by anyone in Terrebonne Parish, and he had no reason to expect that would change. He had 3 enslaved men he intended to sell before October. Their names were Caleb, Barnabas, and Abel. Triplet brothers, 24 years old, born on Fontenot land, worked on it every day since childhood. Fontenot knew them only by function. Caleb organized work crews in the eastern fields. Barnabas handled livestock and blacksmith labor. Abel, deaf since birth, was kept on isolated maintenance work along the western fence line because the overseers considered a man they could not easily command more convenient when kept away from everyone else. Fontenot believed he understood these 3 men. That was his mistake. What he did not understand, what no white man on that plantation had taken the time to notice, was that 3 brothers assigned to different parts of a 2,200-acre property had spent years collecting information. Roads, tool inventories, shift patterns, blind spots, drainage routes, fence weaknesses, and one abandoned structure 6 miles past the western tree line, a structure no practical white man in the parish willingly entered after dark. Belqua Asylum. Belqua had been abandoned since 1841. 3 stories of cracked French colonial stones sinking into the swamp, windows hollow, iron gate rusted open, Spanish moss hanging from the walls like a burial cloth. People said the place swallowed men. They said it as superstition, as folklore, as something to laugh about in daylight and avoid at night. They were right about one thing. Belqua did swallow men. They just never understood how. On September 1st, 1857, Aldrich Fontenot signed the sale papers. 3 separate sales, 3 separate buyers, 3 separate directions. Selling the brothers apart brought more money than selling them together. He signed all 3 documents without hesitation, set down his pen, and moved on with his day. That was the full extent of his concern, because to men like Fontenot, enslaved people did not possess interior lives. They had labor value, market value, transport value, but not plans, not memory, not will, certainly not strategy. He should have asked himself one simple question. Why would 3 men who had caused no serious trouble for years choose the exact week of their sale to run? And if they did run, where exactly were they going? He never asked. Men like Fontenot rarely do. The powerful often mistake silence for emptiness, obedience for stupidity, stillness for surrender. But Caleb, Barnabas, and Abel had not been still. They had been preparing, and months before the sale papers were signed, before the bounty hunters saddled their horses, before Belqua earned its place in parish legend, one of those brothers had already begun walking through that ruined asylum in the dark, studying it room by room, like a man memorizing a weapon. The first thing Caleb understood about Belqua Asylum was that the stories were useful. Not true. Useful. Men in Terrebonne Parish said the building was haunted. They said voices moved through the halls after dark. They said lantern light went in and did not always come back out. They said the place swallowed hunters, trappers, anyone foolish enough to trust the swamp road after sundown. Most people repeated those stories as folklore. Caleb heard them as protection. Because fear keeps practical men at a distance, and distance creates possibility. He first saw the building clearly in July of 1857, during one of the authorized pre-dawn supply runs along the Western Road. He had been assigned that route because he was dependable, because he did not cause trouble, because the overseers had long since stopped thinking carefully about where he went, or what he passed, or what he might be noticing while his head stayed lowered and his hands stayed busy. That was one of Caleb's gifts. He understood early that the safest man on a plantation was often the man mistaken for an obedient one. The Western Road ran within a quarter mile of Belqua. The first time he reached the rise where the tree line opened and the old asylum came into view, he stopped. Not long. Just long enough for the shape of the place to settle into him. 3 stories of stone, broken windows, Spanish moss hanging off the walls like old cloth from a grave, and beneath all of it, something else, structure. Not beauty, not mystery, not even fear, structure. The way the building sat on the swamp, the way the entrance faced the road, the way isolation itself could become an advantage if a man understood how to use it. He kept walking that morning, but he came back, at night, with a small lamp wrapped in cloth. What he found inside was not ghosts, it was geometry. The basement flooded to several feet every season. A natural water channel ran beneath the eastern foundation. Someone long ago had blocked part of it with packed earth and stone. The seal still held, barely. Caleb knelt in the mud and studied the dam the way a carpenter studies a weak beam. How much pressure sat behind it, how little cutting it would take to open, how easily it could be resealed from above. The ground floor corridors had sections where the boards looked solid, but weren't. Years of rising water had softened the joists, not enough to fail on their own, enough to be persuaded. He pressed his palm flat to the floor, measured the give, counted steps, marked in memory which sections would hold one man, and which sections might fail under several. Then he found the maintenance passages inside the walls, narrow service channels meant for supplies and staff movement when the buildings still operated as an institution. 18 inches wide in some places, a thin man could pass through them in darkness. A heavy man with a rifle and boots could not. That mattered, because Caleb was not imagining escape, not yet. He was imagining pursuit, and what happens to pursuers when the space belongs to someone else. By his second visit, he was not exploring. He was studying, the way a soldier studies a map, the way a hunted man studies the habits of the hunter who will one day come looking. He walked every floor, measured the staircase, tested the upper corridor, tracked how sound traveled through the stone. A dropped pebble in one room, a footstep in another. The building spoke if you knew what to listen for. And all the while, back on the Fontenot plantation, the three brothers kept living ordinary lives. Caleb in the eastern fields, Barnabas in the blacksmith shed, Abel at the western fence line. What made them dangerous was not strength alone. It was patience, the kind that slavery accidentally teaches to men who refuse to let it hollow them out. Barnabas learned weights. That was his world. Iron, hooks, chains, crowbars, wedges, lengths of rope. He knew what every tool in the blacksmith shed could do in its proper use, and what it could do somewhere else. He began removing things slowly, never enough to show in a daily inventory. A length of rope over 1 week, 2 wedges over another, cloth and hidden under lumber near the livestock pen. 1 sealed clay jug of lamp oil moved from one shelf to another, then from that shelf to a place outside the shed where only he knew to reach. Abel learned silence. Not because he was born deaf, because he was born observant. The plantation had sent him to isolated work along the western fence line, believing that distance made him easier to manage. Instead, distance made him useful. He knew the swamp-like weather, which birds went quiet when strangers moved through the brush, which ground held after rain, which sections of fence could be loosened and reset without leaving visible signs. He also carried the one gift no overseer ever valued properly. He could see when men were watching too casually to realize they were being watched in return. And between the three of them, there was the language. Their language, built in childhood, expanded in secrecy, precise hand shapes and wrist turns and finger marks that meant full sentences when used together. The overseers had seen them signing all their lives and dismissed it as convenience, a deaf brother accommodated by the hearing ones, nothing more. They never understood that a language no one around you can read is a weapon. It is privacy. It is planning. It is the one room inside slavery where another man cannot enter unless you invite him. 3 nights after Caleb first went into Belqua, the brothers met in darkness behind the quarters. No lamp, no spoken word, only hands moving where no overseer could understand a single thing. Caleb showed them the shape of the building, the flooded basement, the weakened corridor, the staircase, the wall passages, the water channel under the east foundation. Barnabas watched every sign carefully. Abel watched more carefully than either of them. Because when a plan must someday unfold in silence, the deaf brother is not the burden. He is often the center. That night was not the night they decided to run. That decision came later. That night, they decided something else. If they were ever forced into the swamp, Belqua would not be a ruin. It would be a trap. And once a place becomes a trap in a man's mind, he begins preparing it. Over the next several weeks, Caleb returned again and again. Never too often. Never by the same exact path. He worked the building the way waterworks would, slowly enough that no single change announces itself. A joist slightly weakened here, a support edge trimmed there, A rope tested across the eastern staircase banister and then removed. The dam cut once in practice, then sealed back tight. Barnabas joined him on the second full preparation night. Together they carried in tools through 6 miles of black swamp water, with cloth wrapped around the metal to keep it from striking and sounding. They worked in complete darkness after the lamp was covered, by touch, by memory, by trust. Enough to make the corridor fail under weight, not enough to look tampered with, enough to bring down the stairs if the rope was pulled at the right moment, not enough to change how the staircase looked in torchlight, enough to let the building do the killing, while the brothers stayed mostly unseen. Before dawn, they walked back to the plantation in soaked work clothes and lay down in their bunks. And when morning came, they rose and worked like men with nothing in their heads but cane rows and livestock and fence posts. That is what the plantation never understood. A man does not have to appear dangerous to become dangerous. Sometimes all he has to be is patient enough to let the world underestimate him. And by the time Aldrich Fontenot signed the sale papers on September 1st, 1857, Belqua Asylum was no longer an abandoned building. It was waiting. The plan truly began the night Caleb overheard the conversation. 3 nights before September 1st, he was walking the supply road behind the main house when the study window above him opened. Caleb did what enslaved men had been trained to do his entire life. He stopped. He lowered his eyes. He became still. And he listened. The voice belonged to Aldrich Fontenot. The other voice belonged to a trader from Natchez, a man who spoke in numbers. 3 men, 3 buyers, 3 separate directions. The trader said separating them increased the price, 40% more profit than selling them together. Fontenot agreed immediately. Ink scratched across paper. And just like that, 3 lives were divided. Caleb walked back to the eastern fields after that conversation. He finished the day exactly the way he always did. He spoke when spoken to. He corrected work assignments. He kept his face empty. No one noticed anything different. That night, after the plantation lamps went dark, the 3 brothers sat close together in the quarters. Caleb told them what he had heard, not with whispers, with hands. The language moved slowly between them in the dark. Trader coming, sale already signed, 3 buyers, 3 directions, separation permanent. Barnabas did not move for several seconds after the last sign. His jaw tightened the way iron tightens before it bends. Abel watched both of them carefully. He raised one hand. One question. When? Caleb answered with 2 signs. Soon. Run. The decision was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no arguments. The 3 of them had understood for years what separation meant. Once sold to different parishes, the chances of ever seeing each other again would be almost nothing. Slavery did not just steal labor, it stole distance. It scattered families until memory itself became fragile. So the brothers did not debate whether they would run. They debated something else. How many men would come after them? Because Caleb understood one thing clearly. A plantation owner losing 3 able-bodied men days before harvest would not accept the loss quietly. Fontenot would send hunters, professional ones, men who knew the swamp, men who tracked fugitives for money. And those men would not come alone. They would come with numbers, with dogs, with rifles. That was the moment the plan changed shape. Because Caleb was not planning an escape. He was planning a pursuit. And once a pursuit began, Belqua Asylum would become the end of it. Over the next several days, nothing about the brothers changed on the surface. Caleb worked the eastern fields. Barnabas stayed in the blacksmith shed. Abel repaired fence lines near the swamp. They moved with the same quiet discipline they had practiced for years. But each of them began making small adjustments, the kind no overseer notices. Barnabas moved tools. A coil of rope disappeared from the back wall of the shed. 2 iron wedges were wrapped in feed cloth. A crowbar shifted from the workbench to a hidden space beneath the lumber rack. Not all at once. Never enough to appear missing. Abel prepared the fence. There was one section of the western boundary where the wooden post sat loosely in the earth. He worked that post for 4 evenings in a row, just a 1/4 inch each night, enough that the wire could lift silently when the moment came, enough that it would settle back afterward like nothing had changed. Caleb studied time, the most valuable tool he had. He watched which overseer lamps stayed lit the longest, which patrol riders passed the western road at night, how long the dogs at the main house barked when strangers crossed the outer yard. And most important, how long it took a message to travel from the plantation to the nearest town. Because once they ran, the hunters would begin moving within hours. On the morning of September 1st, Fontenot signed the sale papers. At noon, Overseer Duval nailed the notices to the quarter board. 3 names written neatly on the page: Caleb, Barnabas, Abel. 3 buyers, 3 departure dates, 3 destinations in 3 different parishes. Caleb read the paper without expression. Barnabas stood beside him with his shoulders set like a locked gate. Abel could not read the words, but he read their faces with perfect clarity. He raised one hand. One sign. Now? Caleb answered slowly. 3 signs. Yes. Tonight. Swamp. Belqua. That night, the plantation settled into the familiar sounds of evening. Work gangs returned tools. The cookhouse fires burned low. Overseers wrote their daily logs. The dogs lay in the dirt near the main house. Everything looked ordinary. That was the point. Caleb waited until the last overseer lamp went dark. He counted slowly in his head. 30 minutes. Enough time for the men inside to fall fully asleep. Then he raised one hand in the darkness of the quarters and signed a single word. Time. The 3 brothers slipped through the back of the building. Abel had widened a loose plank near the foundation over several nights, just enough for a man to slide through sideways without sound. They crossed the yard behind the tool shed, reached the western fence, and lifted the wire exactly where Abel had prepared it. No dogs barked. No lanterns appeared. The swamp accepted them silently. 6 miles of black Louisiana water stretched ahead, cold channels between cypress roots, mud that tried to pull each step backward, darkness thick enough to erase the sky. Caleb walked first. He navigated by memory. A leaning tupelo tree meant turn left. 2 tall cypress trunks marked the shallow crossing. A line of palmetto meant the ground ahead would hold. He had walked this route in his mind for months. Barnabas followed behind him carrying the tools. Abel moved last, watching the darkness behind them, listening with his eyes the way he always had. An hour from Belqua, Caleb stopped. He turned toward Abel. The 2 brothers looked at each other without signing. The conversation had already happened weeks before. Abel reached into his shirt and pulled out a 4-inch iron nail. He had sharpened the tip himself against the blacksmith's grinding stone. Barnabas turned his face toward the trees, because he already knew what Abel was about to do. Abel drove the nail into his own thigh, clean, precise, deep enough to bleed, not deep enough to kill. He made no sound. He had never made sound in his life. This moment was no different. Caleb wrapped the wound quickly with cloth. Torchlight would show it clearly, from 40 yards away. Because a wounded fugitive is bait, and bait brings hunters closer. They kept walking, through swamp water, through roots and mud and darkness, until the shape of Belqua Asylum finally rose ahead of them in the gray edge of night. Caleb pushed the iron gate open. The three brothers stepped inside, and each one moved to his position without a word. Now all they had to do was wait for the hunters to arrive. The bounty hunters reached Belqua just before sunset. 14 men, 6 dogs, rifles, ropes, and torches. Men who had spent years dragging fugitives out of forests, barns, riverbanks, and swamps. Men who believed they understood how desperate people behaved. Their leader was Wade Tebito, 41 years old, thin, weathered, patient. A man whose reputation was built on method. In 11 years of this work, he had never failed to bring someone back, not once. That mattered to him, because Tebito did not consider himself cruel. He considered himself efficient. He studied terrain. He studied habits. He studied fear. And once he understood those things, he moved. When Fontenot's messenger arrived that morning with the commission letter, Tebito asked 3 questions. How many men had run? Which direction they took? How many hours of head start? 3 men, west toward the swamp. 4 hours. Tebito nodded once, then finished his breakfast. By noon, the hunting party was assembled. 14 riders along the western road. The dogs picked up the scent quickly. 3 men moving through swamp terrain. No hesitation. No doubling back. That detail caught Tebito's attention, because fugitives usually panicked. They circled. They lost direction. They wasted energy. These tracks moved in a straight line, purposeful, controlled. At the 3rd mile, Tebito rode beside his tracker, Guidry. He said quietly, "They've walked this route before." Guidry shrugged. "It won't matter once we corner them." Tebito did not answer, but the thought stayed with him. The dogs stopped at the Belqua gate. Not slowed, stopped. All 6 animals pulled backward against their leads, low growls in their throats, refusing to cross the threshold. The riders exchanged glances. Belqua's reputation was well known in Terrebonne Parish. Men told stories about the place. Voices in the halls. Hunters disappearing. Lantern light that never came back out. Tebito dismounted, because Tebito did not believe in ghost stories. He believed in evidence. He studied the mud near the gate. 3 sets of tracks going inside. No tracks coming out. He looked at the open iron doors, then at the dogs, still refusing to move. In his mind, the calculation was simple. Animals react to rot, to swamp gas, to unfamiliar smells. Buildings like this frightened dogs. Buildings like this frightened men. But fear was not evidence. Tebito turned back to the riders. "Inside," he said. One by one, the men dismounted. 14 torches lifted into the dark entrance, rifles ready, boots stepping carefully across rotting boards. Behind them, the dogs remained outside, sitting in the mud, watching. Belqua swallowed them. Inside the asylum, the air was cold, colder than the swamp outside. Stone walls wet with decades of humidity. Long corridors disappearing into darkness. Torchlight flickered across broken doorways, collapsed ceilings, rooms that smelled of standing water and dust. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Tebito led the search the way he always did. Pairs of men. Each corridor cleared before the next. No one moving alone. Method. Control. discipline. Then the first floor gave way. It happened in the eastern corridor. A rider stepped forward with full weight, and the boards beneath him simply vanished. One moment he was standing. The next, he dropped 8 feet into black water, torch spinning out of his hand, the corridor filling with shouts. The man surfaced quickly, chest deep in cold swamp water, shaken but alive. 2 hunters dragged him back up with rope. The delay lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes where the search stopped. 4 minutes where the building had time to breathe again. Tibito stared down at the broken boards. Something about the break bothered him. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. But old buildings fail all the time, so he pushed the thought aside, and the search continued. Then someone saw Abel. At the far end of the corridor, a figure moving slowly, limping, cloth tied around his thigh soaked dark with blood. A wounded fugitive, exactly what hunters expect to see. The scout raised his hand, signal, target ahead. Tibito made the decision instantly, split the group. 7 men with Guidry to pursue, 7 remain with him to control the building. The correct tactical decision, the logical decision, the decision Caleb had been waiting for. Abel moved deeper into the eastern wing, not too fast, not too slow, just fast enough to keep the hunters following. 7 armed men closed the distance behind him, boots striking wood, torches casting wild shadows across the corridor walls. They rounded the bend near the staircase, exactly where Caleb had predicted they would. Inside the wall above them, Barnabas counted their footsteps through the brick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When the last man crossed the marked floor section, Barnabas pulled the rope. The staircase collapsed, not like an accident, not like rot, but like a mechanism. A single violent crack, wood tearing free, men shouting as the structure behind them dropped away. 7 hunters now stood trapped in a corridor, stairs gone behind them, water already rising silently across the floor. In the central hall, Wade Thibodeau heard the collapse. He froze, torch raised, 7 men still around him. He had entered Belqua with 14. Now he had half that number, and somewhere inside the building, someone else was moving. Because this was no longer a hunt, it was a design, and the hunters had walked straight into it. By midnight, Belqua Asylum had become something else entirely. Not a ruin, not a hiding place, a machine. Water crept through the lower corridors, cold swamp water rising through door frames and broken floorboards. At first it touched boots, then ankles, then knees. Every corridor now led somewhere different than it had before. Some floors no longer held weight, some doors no longer opened. Some rooms filled slowly with black water that reflected the hunter's torchlight back at them like moving mirrors. The men inside the building began to realize something was wrong. Not haunted, planned. Wade Thibodeau stood in the central hall counting. 7 men with him, 7 gone toward the eastern wing. He had entered the building with 14. Now the numbers no longer worked. Somewhere above them, someone was moving. Bootsteps across ceiling beams, light footsteps, careful footsteps. Thibodeau raised his torch, listened. The sounds stopped immediately. The building had gone quiet again. Then another floor collapsed. 2 riders in the western corridor stepped onto boards that had been weakened days before. The wood split beneath them. Both men disappeared into water now deep enough to swallow a man who fell badly. Their torches vanished with them. The hallway dropped into darkness. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Thibodeau had 4 men left. By 1:30, 3. By 2 o'clock, only 2 hunters stood beside him, and Guidry. The water had reached their knees. The building groaned with every shift of weight, and above them, someone was still moving. Thibodeau made the only decision left: higher ground, top floor. They climbed the remaining staircase slowly, rifles ready, boots testing each step. The top corridor stretched ahead in weak torchlight. 3 doors on the left, 2 on the right, 1 room at the end. Thibodeau cleared the first room. Empty. Second room. Collapsed roof. Third room. Nothing but broken furniture and damp air. Then he reached the last door, the examination room. He pushed it open. Abel was waiting inside. He sat on the old examination table with his rifle resting across his knees. The cloth around his wounded thigh was dark with blood. But he sat upright, calm. He looked at Thibodeau the way a man looks at someone whose arrival he has expected for hours. Thibodeau raised his pistol. "On the floor," he ordered. Abel did not move. He slowly placed the rifle on the table beside him, raised both hands. Then he began to sign. His hands moved clearly in the torchlight. Deliberate shapes, deliberate words. Not the quick shorthand he used with his brothers, but the full language, slow enough to read. Because 2 floors below, inside the maintenance passages, Caleb and Barnabas were watching. Abel signed 4 words: "I am ready." Thibodeau frowned. He did not understand the language, but he understood the calm. Guidry stepped forward to grab him. Abel raised 1 finger. "Wait." Then his hands moved one final time. "Go north. Don't look back. I love you both." Abel placed both palms flat on the table and looked directly at Thibodeau. His expression was not fear, not anger, not desperation. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when every decision left to a man has already been made. Thibodeau pulled the trigger. At that exact moment, the floor collapsed. Caleb had weakened the joists weeks before, just enough to hold 1 man, not 3. Thibodeau, Guidry, and Abel, all standing on the same section. The boards gave way instantly. The collapse tore through the upper floor, then the one beneath it, then the flooded basement below. Wood splintered, stone cracked, water surged upward through the broken foundation. Belqua Asylum swallowed the last of the hunters, exactly the way the stories said it did. In the maintenance passage below, Barnabas pressed his back against the brick wall, closed his eyes. 10 seconds. No more. Then Caleb's hand touched his shoulder, and they moved. They slipped out through the northern side of the building, into the swamp, into the final darkness before dawn. By sunrise, they reached the northern road, the sky turning gray above the trees. They walked without speaking, clothes soaked, bodies exhausted, but alive. After the first mile, Barnabas finally signed 1 word: Abel. Caleb looked at him, signed back 2 words. He won. Back on the Fontenot plantation, Overseer Duval counted the empty bunks. 3 missing. 20 minutes later, the horses returned from the swamp road. All 14 of them, saddles empty, reins dragging through the mud. The official record called it a structural collapse, an accident. But the people of Terrebonne Parish knew better. They just never said it out loud. 14 bounty hunters rode into Belqua Asylum. Only their horses came back. And somewhere far north of that swamp, 2 brothers kept walking, carrying the last words Abel had signed in a language no slave owner had ever learned to read. Go north. Don't look back. I love you both. Sometimes resistance is loud. Sometimes it is rebellion. Sometimes it is war. And sometimes it is a plan so patient and so precise that the people who believed they controlled everything never even realize when the world turns against them. And that is exactly what happened inside Belqua Asylum.